Yes, it's the Commodore 64 once again. You'll forgive me for coming back to this popular topic, I'm sure. And can you guess what I'm going to do? Yes, I'm on the hunt for some more limit-pushing games, and this time I'm going to show off some titles that I find surprising for one reason or another. Games that do things you might not know the old murky bolster of dreams could do. And yes, this is pretty subjective, I will admit, but I'll do my best as always to give solid reasons for my choices. But before I go any further, a quick word from today's sponsor, PCB Way. Yes, the one and the only, your one-stop shop for PCB manufacture, 3D printing, CNC machining, injection moulding, assembly and a whole range of related services. And if you're into the C64, well, there's nothing like playing on the original hardware, is there? If you want to do that, then PCB Way has your back with a whole load of retro-focused gaming DIY projects ready to go on their website. If you want to make your own game cartridge, like your own copy of Doc Cosmos for example, or even go all out with a fully featured SD to IEC, there's tons of stuff and you'll be surprised just how inexpensive it is to get going with custom PCBs. Prices start from $5, and with a $5 coupon for all new users, you might find your first project costs you next to nothing. I myself have some plans on this front which you may well be seeing soon. There's all sorts of mods and upgrades I want to do to my retro hardware, and that's going to be made a lot easier thanks to PCB Way. So have a look at the links right at the top of the description, and thank you PCB Way for sponsoring this video. Okay then, let's get going with Flimbo's Quest, released by System 3 in 1990. And look what we have here. Not hard to guess what's surprising about this. It's got what appears to be multi-plane parallax scrolling. This is something that the C64 absolutely should not be able to do. It just doesn't have the hardware capabilities. And this isn't just a simplistic repeated background texture as some other games with parallax effects seem to have, like for example this effect in Enforcer Full Metal Mega Blaster. Flimbo's Quest looks like it's got two fairly complex scenes laid on top of each other. In every level we have the platforms that the player and enemies jump around on at the front, and the distant background scene at the back featuring buildings, trees and all sorts of things on the various levels. So why is this so surprising? Well, the old Torp terminal has at most two separate elements that make up its graphics. There is the background or the main display area and the sprites, sprites being a layer of objects that can move independently of that background. On the C64, the background can either be a bitmap, where data for each pixel is stored separately, or it can be character-based, where the display is made up from a set of ready-made graphic elements, not a million miles away from the tile-based graphics of systems like the NES in the way that it works. Most games made use of the character-based graphics because it tends to be faster and takes up less memory, and Flimbo's Quest here seems to be no exception. The thing is though, there is definitely only one layer of characters. This is not like 16-bit machines with multiple background layers that can move independently. There's one, and that's your lot. So how on earth can there be two layers? Well, sprites are one possibility. Other games have used them for parallax effects, but that doesn't seem to be the case here. Having a look at the C64 debugger program by Slajerek and Samar. Having a look at the C64 debugger program by people whose names I'm never going to be able to pronounce shows that sprites, highlighted with red borders here, are used for just what you'd expect them to be usually, the player and enemies and such like that. The extra background layer seems to be way too large to be made of sprites anyway. Another view from this very powerful C64 debugging emulator gives us a clue though as to what might be going on. What we have here are four different character sets. These are the elements that the main display graphics are made up from, as they are stored in the memory. Usually you'd only have one set in use at once, but here we have four, and they're all identical apart from one key difference. The distant background graphics, the stuff that makes up the furthest layer, are all shifted into different positions in each set. It's probably a bit easier to see when I flick through them like this. How does this equal what looks like another background layer? Well, that's the clever part. The apparent movement of the second layer is made by switching between the 4 character sets as the screen scrolls. The C64 has some built-in scrolling capabilities which are used here, so as the game scrolls left or right, it cycles through the 4 character sets either forwards or backwards depending on the direction. This makes the far background appear to move more slowly than the foreground. It might seem hard to believe that that's all it takes, but it works. This view here might clear things up a little bit. When I cycle through the 4 manually, you can see the far background appear to move. When it reaches the end of the cycle, all the graphics are redrawn with the characters in new places and it starts again. It seems like Flimbo's Quest wasn't actually the first game to use this technique. Hawkeye from Thalamus, released in 1989, seems to have been the originator of it. Interestingly here though, it's just used to create a static, distant background rather than one that moves, but it is done the same way with multiple character sets. It does once again though look quite uncannily good, and I believe there are even more games out there that do the same thing. I don't think though I've ever seen this on any game on any other system. If you can think of any games on anything besides the Commodore 64 that do parallax scrolling in this same way, well, do let me know in the comments below. Some NES games used a more primitive version of it to create repeating tiles parallax effects, but I don't think any went as far as this, even though it might have been technically feasible to do it with the help of enhancement chips. This technique does have its limits though, and these 2 games have both been cleverly engineered to hide them, the biggest one being that everything has to fit exactly into 8 pixel character blocks for the illusion to work. Turrican 3 uses a very similar effect, but it's not quite as well hidden. The background is simpler than Flimbo's Quest, but it's the same idea, and you can see the edges of these rocks where the effect doesn't quite work, and we're left with a blue bit of sky around what's supposed to be a sloping rock. For this to be seamless, everything in the foreground needs to be made out of perfectly square blocks. Not that Turrican 3 isn't an absolutely amazing game in every other way, of course, well worth playing. Anyway, let's move on from parallax scrolling for a bit. I think we'll come back to it soon, and let's take a look at something more modern with Doc Cosmos. Released in 2019, this is of course a modern C64 game. In fact, that's kind of the gimmick. It's a platform game but with a time travel mechanic, moving back and forth between the ancient 1982 and the modern timelines, both appropriately different in their controls to solve puzzles and open the doors and progress. A charming retro indie thing, and I love it. What's so surprising about it though? Well, it all fits into a 16KB cartridge that is tiny, and all the original C64 cartridges allowed for. How can this game be so fantastic? On other platforms, 16KB wouldn't get you very far at all. There was, as far as I can tell, only one NES game with such a small size, and that was Galaxian, a fine port of the Golden Age arcade game, but nowhere near the complexity of Doc Cosmos. Things maybe look a bit better on the Spectrum, with some of its best loved early classics like Jetpack fitting into its own 16KB cartridge format, but still nothing quite like this. Cartridges were never that popular for the C64, cassettes and discs were both cheaper and had higher capacities, but for a while in the early days cartridge releases were relatively common. In recent times though, homebrewers have taken up the format as a bit of a challenge, and more than a few new releases have appeared on these tiny ROM carts. The C64 does more with 16K than you might think possible, in part at least because its architecture gives it a couple of advantages. Number 1 is RAM. The C64's 64KB means that data stored on cartridges can be compressed and then unpacked into this RAM, meaning you can effectively cram more data in there, and that's just what Doc Cosmos does, unpacking data into RAM when the machine is switched on. This is something the NES could never hope to do in the same way, as it only has 2KB of system RAM to play with. The ZX Spectrum could do a bit better with up to 48KB, but actually ZX Spectrum cartridges are nearly all compatible with the smallest 16KB model. On top of that, the C64 retains access to its built-in ROMs even when a cartridge is plugged in, meaning that if nothing else, its built-in font can be used, saving some space there, a luxury the Speccy didn't have. The choice of Doc Cosmos is a bit arbitrary really, to be honest. There's a ton of other kart-based games I could have picked. I'll put some links below, but this just happens to be a very good game that I like a lot and I think shows off what you can do with 16K on the old Brown Beloved. Also, it does actually make use of alternative character sets like the games I've already discussed, but for different reasons. Here the switch between the two time periods is done by switching the two separate character sets, which each have separate designs for the elements that make up the graphics, and you can see them being switched back and forth here. A superb game all round. You can name your own price for the download, I'll put the link below, but why not give the author a few quid, and it is compatible with the Vice emulator if you don't have any way of getting it on the real hardware. And if I can, I'd like to just take a moment here and remind you, if you haven't already, to like this video and subscribe if you'd like to see more of this kind of thing. It helps this channel out, it really does. Right then, what's up next? Well, how about something so completely different? I can't think of a way of gracefully seeging into it, so I'm just going to jump right in and say, let's have a look at Metal Dust. Released in 2005, it seems, by Genesis Project, it's an absolutely stunning C64 game, loaded from start to finish with absolutely jaw-dropping amazing graphics and stunning music. So much happening on the screen, so many sprites, huge bosses and some really incredible parallax effects. This stuff looks so much better than anything you would usually expect to see on an 8-bit machine. It's only the unmistakable C64 colour palette and those chunky pixels that give it all away. But it's too good to be true, isn't it? This can't be running on the original Commodore, can it? No, it can't, and it isn't. Yes, this game has rather high system requirements for a C64 title. It requires the 1581 3.5-inch floppy drive with its expanded capacity over the original Commodore 64 drive just to start with. Plus, and this is the big one, it requires the Super CPU expansion and the 4MB Super RAM card. The Super CPU being a ridiculously powerful add-on for the C64, released originally in 1996. It adds a whole new CPU to the system, a 65C816S to be precise, running at 20 MHz, the same CPU that powered the Super NES in fact, but running at a much faster clock speed. This device was sadly not on the market for all that long and is now darn near impossible to get hold of, and this is about the only game out there written specifically for it from the ground up, though there are quite a few projects that can make use of it. With this in mind, the game starts to look a little less amazing. I don't want to take away from what the creators did, it's still a fantastic achievement, but with a bit more context, it starts to make more sense. Except for one thing though, one thing that really is kind of surprising even with the Super CPU on board and running the show, and that is the music and audio effects. Yes, have a listen. It really is incredible that this is coming out of our friend the old Sable Slab. The Super CPU can do a lot, but how can it upgrade the sound capabilities of the machine so much? The C64's sound chip, the SID, is definitely a cut above pretty much all of its competition from way back then, with a quality of sound that manages to come closer to professional synths than most of the haunted doorbell sounds that came out of other early home computers. Still though, its 3 oscillators and various filters and envelopes can't do what we're hearing here. It's a different sort of sound altogether. In fact, the soundtrack for this game was done in collaboration with German band Welle Erdball and features sounds that go far beyond what the SID can do on its own. So what's happening? Well, as it turns out, this was never an intended feature, but the SID can be made to output digital samples with a bit of clever hacking. And that's entirely what this is, digital samples being streamed off the disk. Usually this technique is too CPU intensive and too memory hungry to even consider using it in games. There are some demos that do it, but you couldn't expect to be running all the stuff a game needs as well, unless Well, unless you've got the super CPU and a lot of extra RAM. So alright, I'm sure many of you will say this is cheating, but I still like it, and I definitely found it a surprise. So moving on then, one more title to look at before I slink off once again, one more surprise, and why not another modern game from 2020, it's Zeta Wing by Sarah Jane Avery. An absolute winner this one, it looks amazing, it plays really well, easily equal to or better than any commercial game that came out in the old days. In fact, it is a commercial game, it's $3.99 and is well worth it for what was maybe the best C64 release of 2020. The shooter Gemini Wing seems to be the main inspiration here, the arcade shooter that had a very fine official conversion on the C64. I'm not sure if this is supposed to be a sequel or what, but it strides ahead of the original quite spectacularly and brings to mind classic NES shooters as much as anything, shades of Compile and Konami definitely. As great as it is, you might be wondering what the surprising part is, and well, it's this. Yes, these slightly vertigo-inducing vertical parallax trenches that look an awful lot like what we saw in that classic NES limit pusher Crisis Force. It looks good and it's an effect that I've never seen on the C64 and I would have assumed it could never do it if I'd thought about it. Why is this special? Well, the horizontal equivalent isn't. You'll see quite a lot here on the C64 and on other 8-bit systems too, the game Katakis being a very fine example. Yes, it's the same thing but the other way around, horizontal splits in the scrolling instead of vertical ones, and there's a few ways that this can be done. One of them is to use some kind of timer that alters the rate that the screen scrolls at as it's being drawn. For each split in the screen, an alert goes off that says something to the effect of keep this bit still, move this bit on at this rate, move the next bit on at another rate, and so on. Doing the same thing with vertical splits though is much more difficult. Even on the C64 and NES that both have built-in vertical scrolling capabilities, you can't split it up in the same way. To do that you'd need to be making changes in the middle of a scan line or a row of pixels that's being drawn, and that happens too quickly for it to be practical. Some 16-bit machines had this capability built in. The Super NES and the Mega Drive could do what was called column scrolling, but not our brown beloved. So how's it being done? Well, it's a neat little hack that's similar to but not exactly the same as the way it's done on the NES Crisis Force. If we take a look into the memory, specifically the character set again, we can see the textures of the trench walls and they're moving. On the NES, the enhancement chip was used to switch between different tiles to create this movement, but here on the C64 it looks like the shifting is done in software. A bit of code that shifts the patterns of dots each frame. When these patterns are drawn all over the screen, well, it looks like movement. This can only really work if it's made up out of a small number of repeating elements, else you'd run out of time trying to redraw it all each frame. But it works nicely in this scenario and makes for a really eye-catching effect that makes this game stand out. It's used quite a lot throughout all the stages, and it looks especially good when it's combined with other landscape features in the foreground, so to speak, giving the look of these great big holes. There's even some sections like here where the edges seem to overlap. This is done by having fixed elements in the animated characters. Hopefully this view makes it a bit clearer. Yes, a really fantastic game. I recommend tracking this down, which won't be hard to do because I'll put a link below, so give it a go. Okay then, I think I'm spent, I've had enough and I'm going to take my ball home, but don't think that this will be the last you hear from me on the old Contre Amiral Soixante Quatre, as they probably don't but should call it in France. I do have a feeling that a lot of people are going to be suggesting Sam's Journey as a game I should have covered. Amazing as it is, I don't think it quite fits this video, but I will be featuring it in the future, definitely, so watch this space. So let's wind this down. If you'd like to support me on Patreon, that would be amazing. It really helps me to keep making videos. There's a link in the description. And thank you as ever to all the very generous people who are already supporting me. Your help is greatly appreciated. Thank you very much, people. If you haven't already hit that like button, well, this is your last chance, and I'm going to sign off and say thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time, folks.